This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
Dave on the board.
And we need to say that this is WEFT and that we have substantial support from the Urbana Public Television, and we're videotaping this. That means we look for your support sometimes, just to keep this rolling. Also would like to announce the annual photographic print competition in Lincoln Square. It's very popular, and it's for February 5th, 13 through 21, and entry deadline is February 3. So don't forget that. The Camera Club has been involved in that pretty heavily, and it's a good show. So I have a guest, Glenn Martin, and he's here to talk about his father, who was a professor of sculpture at the University of Illinois, but quite an interesting character. And Glenn used to work here, and Kathy, his wife, worked with us too, and so we know each other pretty well from a local point of view. But I think there's enough detail with your father that I'd like to concentrate on that. So I'll let you talk. I first of all thought it was very nice to have a little introduction about what is an artist. And there's a nice statement. I thought the first paragraph there might be rather interesting to read.
Yes, this
you might know it without having to read it.
Well, this is a book that's been kind of in the process of coming together seriously for about 4 years, and bits and parts of it even before that. So, but maybe the last 2 years we really concentrated almost daily on it. But the introduction talks about, I think, interesting about how art relates to everyone. And so I'll just read the first paragraph if you like. How does a person become an artist, and what constitutes that identity? There is no definitive answer to this question, but rather it suggests a quest to know more about the path one follows to become an artist. One certain parameter would be a devotion to artistic practice to an extent that a person makes a living at his or her craft. Other vital qualities are a constant curiosity about the world and a drive to explore innovation and new ways of using materials. Perhaps the most profound quality of an artist is the relentless yearning to express an elusive essence of time, place, and truth. And I find that really, that last sentence really is a characteristic that I've detected in people that are practicing artists.
They have, when I first came here, they called it a passion. And I thought that was rather a sick term, but I gradually got used to the fact that that was used to say this person has an involvement that is very serious. And it's often what leads to good research, good librarianship. You're a librarian, and you have a background in landscape architecture, and so you bring a certain quality to that, and often that's what makes these sorts of things work. And we didn't say much about our mission, but over the years what we have tried to do is to bring people to some of the details of their life that let other people know about their background and how it affects their career. So, yeah, I was very interested in the history. So from year on,
Yeah.
and you probably can waddle us through some of that history. It ends up in Colorado, away in the northwest corner of Colorado, and I think it's, what's the name of the county?
Well, it's just one item. I'm not a librarian. I am a library staff person. Just as a little, in case there are librarians out there listening, I don't want to. That's a degreed position, and I respect them. And I'm not a degreed librarian. I work.
Degreed landscape architect.
Yes, but yes, it is an interesting history, and part of it, I think, the message is that anyone has the potential of being an artist, and because it comes from a creative urge that I mentioned in this introduction is almost an instinctive, innate quality of human beings, and that during one's life experience, particularly the early years, that capacity, that interest can be either enhanced and brought out, or it can be completely destroyed. And to do that is to limit one's creative urges, artistic abilities, is to deny, a basic instinct that people have, because all you have to do is look at the archaeological record, and you see that artistic enhancement is part of what human beings do with everything. So this is a story about someone that came from an unlikely background to be a sculptor, and my dad once said during my kind of rebellious teenage years, he said, this is a long way from the homestead.
Yes.
From what he had achieved, although his experience growing up in the wilds of Colorado never left him. It was a basis of his awareness and his appreciation for life and for opportunity that can come to one.
I want to go back to where your parents came from in the long run, but I want you to say something about the cabin that he grew up with, the sagebrush area that he grew up with a brother. And there's a nice picture, so you're on the radio, so if you can describe this building, it's made of logs, it's cute.
Well, it's interesting. I once took a canoe trip in the upper Missouri in Montana, and very remote country. And on this canoe trip, I would occasionally see old homesteads that had been abandoned, and I was struck how similar they were to the homestead cabin my dad grew up in. And basically what would happen is usually a man would go out and lay claim or be assigned to an area in the public domain and hurry about building a cabin to survive the coming winter. And they had a tent that summer, lived in a tent, and went up into, this is basically sagebrush country, so they would go a couple of miles into the hills and cut cedar and pinyon pine logs, haul them down by horse, and built a cabin, a one-room cabin it was kind of rough and quick, and that's what they lived in the first winter. Dirt floor, and you'd tamp it down and wet it and tamp it down some more, and it'd become as hard as concrete. And it is very rugged country. I think it was in the late 1960s, they recorded minus 60 degrees below zero there, incredibly cold. And that may have been an extreme, but it was rugged country to live in during the winter. And the next year, what happened, a typical thing was there would be more time then to build an addition to the cabin that would be a little more refined. And that's what they did. They built enlarged, more than doubled the size of the cabin. But had a roof with small branches, and then a tarp, and then sod put on top of that. And this second edition actually had a wood floor, so that was a big deal. And one of their big events was to go to Craig, about 40 miles away, and get a roll of linoleum to put on the dirt floor. So it was no grocery stores to go to, no electricity, no modern equipment, no radios, no phone. And so people were on their own, had to be very self-sufficient.
Had to hunt.
Yeah, they had a garden, and then the rest was maybe some chickens and eggs, but venison and sage hens were the source of food, the protein.
Well, let's go back to where your family came from, because it waddles its way through the U.S. and gets involved with Civil War and slavery, and it's an interesting read to read that history and to know that it's someone that you know and understand, rather than a general history. It's you get specific.
Well, the earliest folks came over from Ireland and England, and what I'm amazed that this story, as I researched it, and I think is typical, is just how much people moved around in the early days of this country. I mean, we think of people still being quite mobile, but of course they settled first in the Carolinas and Virginia, and then went to Alabama, and one of the members of the family was named Mundy, and he went to Texas to fight in the Mexican War, and with Sam Houston, and after the war, he really settled permanently in Alabama. And this came, of course, after the Indian Removal Act of 1830, when all the tribes in the southeast were forced to relocate to what is now Oklahoma, and threw open all this land in the south for development. And Mundy established a large landholding in northwestern Alabama, and along the Tennessee River, and near Stevenson. And this was, building up before the Civil War. There was a lot of turmoil politically and socially in this country about the issue of slavery, and abolition was, and the push for abolition was a big issue that was hotly debated in the country. And this led them to consider that things were going to get very chaotic, and so they decided to sell off their holdings in Alabama and go to Texas and start over on the edge of the frontier. And so their trip to Alabama actually took, or their trip to Texas actually took a couple of years. And
people died in the way?
Yes, both Mundy, senior James Mundy and his wife, both died on the journey, and so they had 9 kids. And so the oldest daughter was married to rather cantankerous and rough individual who may have had some involvement in what happened to the senior Monday dine. But they arrive in Texas, and the middle girl had had enough, and she just ran off and found a farm and introduced herself, and that's how she met the Martins. And so they kind of took her in, and she lived with them. And their oldest son had, just shortly before that, joined the Gano Brigade out of Tarrant County, Texas. This became a Confederate cavalry unit. And many of the men in the South were quite good at outdoor living and horsemanship, and it didn't take a lot of training to get them in order. So that the Gano Guards, as they were called, sent immediately to Kentucky and Tennessee, and joined with other Confederate units. John Hunt Morgan was there, the raider, and his idea was he was going to send a large Confederate force north of the Ohio River to harass and draw Union forces, keep them in the north rather than permitting them to go in farther into the South. And during these military skirmishes, some very bloody skirmishes, Newt Martin, this young man, was shot off his horse and captured and given remedial medical treatment and sent to Fort Chase, Ohio, Union prison, for holding Confederate personnel near Columbus. And the war, at that point, there had been prisoner exchanges between both sides, but the South largely violated the protocol of these soldiers not being permitted to go back into active military duty, because the South was had such a loss of personnel that they couldn't afford not to return these ex-prisoners back into their military units. But at this point, Newt was paroled back to the South, probably because he had serious military wounds from his battle in Tennessee. And so we don't know what he did, but he probably did some civilian work or hospital medical work. But eventually, the Civil War came to an end, and Newt was released, and the Union had created opportunity for Union and ex-Confederate soldiers to return home by giving them railroad passes and passes on riverboats to get home, to get the country back, the economy of the country back on order. The devastation of the Civil War it's hard to fathom today. Estimates range from 600,000 to 750,000 deaths from the Civil War. Maybe 3 million horses and mules, destruction of the infrastructure of the South. It's just almost impossible to understand the devastation that was prevalent in the U.S., particularly the South, after the Civil War. And it took really 100 years to fully recover. And in many ways, the South still has, wounds from the destruction that took place in the Civil War.
There was a little resume of the history that the Southern power base was mainly wealthy people, and they were the slave owners, and there were still pockets of more menial people who had slaves perhaps, but didn't have a lot of slaves, and they weren't as seriously into the secession that went ahead with the South.
Yes, I mentioned that it's a hard thing to understand that slavery was supported and promoted by really a thin band of wealthy elite people, and the vast majority of white people were pretty much marginalized. But just through the culture and the propaganda, you had robust enlistment to support the South. And basically, the only issue, it says a lot of people try to apologize for the secession of the South. But when you get right down to it, the only issue really was slavery, an abolition of slavery. And it benefited, the culture of the South. And people in the North benefited from the production of plantation-grown commodities. So there was a lot of dishonest, self-serving moralism. But the fact is, people in the North, many sectors in the North benefited from the international sale of commodities that came from slave labor. And, the country's never really reconciled that issue. And you'd think it would happen, like a national apology for slavery. I would have thought maybe President Obama would be able to do that. But there should be some statement of recognition of the damage done to African people through slavery. But as that national recognition has yet to be heard. And so, the Mundys had slaves, and
they begged to be taken with the family.
There's another phenomenon, that the idea of I mentioned, not belonging to someone, to some place, was a pretty terrifying experience, I would assume, for slaves, because manumission, or the freeing of slaves, was not even legal. And so if a African was found out, not attached to some place, they could be captured, apprehended, and sold, and a family broken apart, members never to see each other again, perhaps. So, to live someplace where there was a semblance of dependability of treatment and an understanding of the situation, it's quite natural to want that to continue rather than to be thrown into unknown and maybe chaotic circumstances.
They could have been sold for $1,000.
Yes.
But that would have put them in the sort of situation you're talking about.
Right. So the Mundys left Alabama with their large family, and a slave family they took with them, and headed into Arkansas and lived there for a couple of years while they got covered wagons and oxen to pull them. And just as they were nearing the time to leave for Texas, the wife of the older slave family, she died, and her husband did not want to leave, so he wanted to stay behind, and so Mundy sold him to the landowner where they had been staying for 2 years, and so that family was able to remain and stay as a unit. And that's another thing about the economy of the South. Slaves were expensive, and there was a lot of investment in buying and selling slaves. And so when Lincoln signed the proclamation to free the slaves in the states in rebellion, that investment was just immediately drained away. And that's what created a lot of outrage among wealthy white people in the South that had a lot of money invested in slaves.
And there was some godly involvement too. The churches were justifying this in a way. To have a slave was to be, you might have 1,000 slaves if it was a big property.
Well, yeah, it almost seems like crazy today. You can't believe, but ministers and churches in the South found all kinds of ways to manipulate reality in order to support slavery, to think it was a good thing. It was good for the slaves. It was good for the economy. So it's, when you read some of these sermons and some of these political manifestos by Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, you just shake your head. How could people become so twisted in their perception of reality to justify an institution, the strange institution, as it was called by Northerners? But that's the way it was just a brief 120 years ago.
Alabama was an area where you had alluvial and floodplains, and you had cotton and other crops, sugar, and that were making it. But gradually, the movement, certain people were moving west, and your family was doing that.
Yeah, these alluvial rich soils in the Carolinas, and then when the Indians were forced out, the bottomlands of Mississippi and Alabama those were the two real big hotbeds of slave-supported plantation agriculture. And those crops were labor-intensive, tobacco and cotton and rice and indigo. They took a lot of hand labor. And eventually, 100 years later or less than that, machinery finally came in to harvest cotton. But yes, so they eventually get to Texas, and they settle in what's called the Red River counties of northern Texas that border the river between Oklahoma and Texas. And one of the amazing things that happened there is this controversy about secession and abolition really divided the white people there. And plus, the Confederate government instituted conscription, basically the draft. So you had to go into the military. And if you didn't espouse support for the South and disdain for abolition, you were suspected of being a sympathizer for the Union and for abolition. And what happened in these Red River counties is, gossip and rumor started to spread. People started to turn on each other, and it led to apprehending people that were suspected of having a resistance to wanting to secede from the United States. And they held some kind of mass court and found people guilty, and they hung over 40 people. It's called the Great Gainesville Hanging, one of the most amazing, atrocious events in American history. And they hunted down a lot of other people and shot them down. So the turmoil just among white Southerners was significant. West Virginia, the western counties of the state of Virginia broke away. They didn't want to leave the United States. So they formed the state of West Virginia. And an interesting historical factoid was a county in Mississippi that rebelled and seceded from the Confederacy. And in Jones County, Mississippi, there was armed rebellion against the Confederacy. And the Confederacy had to expend a lot of time and energy to keep people in line. There were always, especially the hill people that lived on the less fertile lands, weren't big on slavery and weren't big on the idea of leaving the United States. And so the Confederates had to have spies and patrols to make sure people weren't, helping the Union behind the lines. So it was it was questionable that the South could ever have succeeded. Their only hope was to get immediate, quick victories and then get France and England to recognize the South, and that never came. The England outlawed slavery in 1840, approximately. So, and Jefferson Davis was, while an intelligent man, was not a good commander-in-chief. He micromanaged and controlled, it was very controlling, and wouldn't let the various Confederate armies communicate with each other. Everything had to go through him, so that they couldn't coordinate their military activities with one another to be more effective. General Lee probably would have been a much better commander-in-chief for the Confederacy than Jefferson Davis. But
So now you're in Texas. So,
So-
what, you move away from Texas.
so yeah, after after the Civil War, gets home, and
And the trip home was amazing. It involved running up and down the Mississippi with
Yeah.
a paddle steamer, and one paddle steamer totally overloaded with a bad boiler burst, and
there was a lot. These river boats were not well built. They were only built to last 5 or 6 years, and cheaply built to carry commerce. And Newt Martin got a train ride across the north to Tolono, Illinois, and hopped on another train down to Cairo, got on the riverboat Centennial, and took that down to New Orleans. And just a few months before, the greatest maritime disaster in American history occurred at Memphis, and the riverboat Sultana going north, carrying a huge load of Union soldiers that had just been released from Andersonville prison. They were all in bad shape. The captain of the riverboat bribed officials, and these riverboats could carry about 400 people. He paid bribes and got over 2,500 people loaded on the Sultana. And the boat was top-heavy, the decks were sagging, and on the way north from New Orleans to Memphis, one of the boilers started leaking. The captain wouldn't allow it to be fixed properly. So as they passed Memphis at 2 a.m. in the morning in April, all the boilers exploded, blew soldiers off into the flood-swollen, frigid Mississippi at 2 a.m. in the morning, and over 1,700 emaciated Union soldiers died. It was an incredible event, and not a lot is known about it. It wasn't publicized because it happened near the same time that President Lincoln was assassinated. General Lee had capitulated the Army of Northern Virginia, and John Wilkes Booth would be captured just a week or two later. So there's so much going on that this tragic event didn't get that much coverage at the time. And they had some congressional hearings, but not much happened.
so let's say that we're talking to Glenn Martin, who has a family history that has been well documented. Fortunately, the family has put together diaries and history that could be followed. And so this is WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and we'll go back to Glenn. And we've got Newt somewhere. He had to walk 175 miles.
Yeah, he got to New Orleans and took a smaller boat up the Red River, which is a shallower, more log-jammed river, and to Shreveport, and then got out in various modes of transportation, walking, getting rides on carts, a little bit of train ride. He finally got back to Pilot Point, Texas, and the family was just, they passed out practically to see him knocking at the door after 4 years. And he slowly recovered and got back to some normalcy, married Amanda Mundy, this girl who had run to their house a couple years before, and after a while they decided that Amanda's brothers from that arduous trip had gone out to the panhandle of Texas and become cowboys, and she thought it'd be good to go out and join them. So they moved out to Childress, Texas, and established a farm out there.
Sort of more poverty area of Texas, I think.
Well, it's wide cattle country, wide open, wild, very remote at that time, and they started their family, and that's one of their children was my grandfather, and they named him Martin, and we call him Senior, and he grew up and became a cowboy out there too, running cattle with his mom's brothers, his uncles, through the Panhandle, and a couple of his sisters went to a normal school, and normal schools were institutions created to train teachers. These would be students.
Normal, Illinois.
Yeah, Normal named after it, and there are a lot of Normals around. And they, promising students in high school, and not a lot of people graduated high school in those days, if they were promising students, they were encouraged to become teachers, and they would go to an institution called a normal school, or a school where they teach norms of education. And this was at Clarendon, Texas, in the Panhandle. And there they met another woman named Jessie Fuller, and they made a bond with her, liked her a lot, and at the same time, maybe a year before that, their brother had been in a gunfight in Childress in like you see in the movies, in the old Western movies, and the local sheriff arrested him, and he was sent to prison for a couple of years, and was released with the proviso. The judge said, "You'd better settle down and get married and live a lawful life, or I'm going to see you again, and it won't be good if I see you again." And so his sisters knew that this woman, Jessie Fuller, would be just right, and so they encouraged them, introduced them, and it worked. They developed a relationship and eventually got married in 1904 and went to the St. Louis Exposition as a honeymoon. That was like a World's Fair, a big deal, and it was quite an exciting event. And so they then moved back to Childress, and they started their family. They had a child, and they'd moved farther west in the Panhandle near a town called Texline on the New Mexico border. And after a year, their little baby died. And in those days, most kids, a lot of kids died before they got to be 3 or 4 years old. It's very common. And that obviously shook them up, and they decided to move back. Marvin's father, Newt, the Civil War veteran, had died, and the uncles had encouraged Amanda to sell off the farm and move back to near Fort Worth, where there was a Methodist college. Newt had become a lay minister for the Reverend Martin, they called him, for the Methodist minister. And there's a Methodist college was established at Polytechnic, right on the edge of Fort Worth. And so she moved back there, and with the money from selling the farm, she built a boarding house to rent out rooms to students. And so her son Marvin and his wife Jessie moved back to live with her for a while, for a couple of years. And at that point they had another child, and that was my father, Marvin Martin Jr. So after they after time passed on, they found more land was going to be open for homesteading in northwestern Colorado. So they headed up to northwestern Colorado with Marvin Jr. and another child that had been born, his brother, Harry Hall. And in that day, it was a long way. You know, the railroad ran to Colorado Springs and Denver, but from there on, it was you had to go by wagon train and horse. And just a few months before they knocked through the railroad to Steamboat Springs in northwestern Colorado, and they would have freight cars loaded up with homesteaders and all their equipment and horses and get dropped off at Steamboat. And they would head out, that was Routt County, a vast county, and they would head out by horse and wagon to lands that had been assigned to them. And that's how they found acreage to lay claim to south of Maybell in northwestern Colorado, and that's where they built their cabin. Yeah, it was dry, open sagebrush country.
And the two children had a riotous time just discovering.
That was
the
must have been
sagebrush.
a great place to grow up, because it just, you could go anywhere, and that's what they did. As they got old enough to be on horse, they could go anywhere, do anything. It was a wild, difficult time for adults, but for children, it's what they knew, and they adapted and became part of the land and adapted.
Your grandmother was a teacher, and she rode horse.
Since she went to the normal school, she got a job teaching out there, and she'd be assigned to a couple of districts. And sometimes they'd be far flung, but eventually she got an assignment in Maybell, which was about 6 miles from the homestead. So she'd ride in there, and as the boys got old enough, they'd ride their horses into school. And it was a good influence for them to have a teacher for their mother, because she instilled really a demand and expectation of their children.
Straight-laced.
She's very straight-laced and opinionated and Victorian in her attitudes about a lot of things. But she being a teacher, had a meager income, and as a role model, the kids really learned their lessons and became pretty educated.
Well, I'm watching the clock a little bit, so we've got time. So now you're starting on the history of your father.
Yeah. Now we'll fast forward. After Jessie, the mother, and Marvin Sr. realized they're out in that remote country. There were no high schools, and it was so difficult to make a living out on that land. They decided Marvin Sr. found a job with the railroad, and he was assigned to Sterling, Colorado, on the opposite end of the state in the northeast corner. So they sold off the homestead in 1920 and moved to Sterling, and this allowed the kids to go to high school, and that was really an exciting time for my dad. He just thoroughly enjoyed the action and the opportunities and got involved in everything, playing football and track and the drama and the academics. And they unusual had an art program and a good art teacher, and he had become interested in drawing out on the homestead when he had developed polio and had to stay in bed for long weeks, and a traveling nurse had brought him art supplies to keep him occupied, and he fully recovered without any impairment, but his interest in drawing just grew all the time, and he became notorious in art school in high school in the art class, because he was so good and enthusiastic about drawing. And in fact, he took correspondence school, the Landon School of Cartooning. He would get correspond and send in work and get evaluations and suggestions. And so he just thoroughly loved that. And his art teacher saw real potential, and she actually helped encourage him to go on and become an artist, go to art school, and helped write a letter to the Kansas City Art Institute. So when he graduated, he had applied and got accepted to go there. But he first needed to work on the railroad. His dad got him a job working on the line crew, saved his money, and off he went after he graduated from high school. In the fall of 1925, he headed to Kansas City. And that was an institution that had been around about 25, 26 years, had grown from a local group of interested citizens into an actual institution. And so he went to Kansas City and actually got scholarships to support and some side jobs.
With newspapers.
Yeah, he eventually got a job with the Kansas City Star that doing work on ads, and he was assigned to do the religion section. So he would draw up illustrations of religious events and did some amazing work. And he got a raise, and he could only go to night school at that point at the Institute. So he worked for a couple of years at the Star, and then he had saved up enough, and with more scholarships, he returned full-time and graduated from the sculpture program in 1934.
Wonderful sculpture teacher.
He had a great sculpture teacher, Wallace Rosenbauer. And it's interesting, Benton was teaching painting, and Thomas Hart Benton was teaching painting, and Gutzen Borglund that did the Mount Rushmore, he was there briefly teaching sculpture, so he had contact with him. Had a great faculty, and even Walt Disney was a student there at that time. He actually lived in Kansas City and went through their illustration program. So Marvin had some interesting friends and great faculty, and traveled about.
Went to Mexico.
Went to Mexico and New York City and San Francisco, hitchhiking. Everybody hitchhiked in those days. But after he left art school, he moved to Denver. Decided that was the place to go, and started, set up a little studio and started
gold
sculpting.
and other commodities in Denver.
Yeah, Denver, was
Mining.
a booming place, but at that, it was also the Depression had hit, and so it was really a rough time. But Marvin had grown up in pretty lean times, so he wasn't in shock. He knew how to live on the edge. But Franklin Roosevelt came in and started the WPA to help put the nation back to work, and a subset of that program was the FPA, the FAP, I should say, the Federal Arts Project was a component of the WPA, where they employed artists, and a lot of the murals and post offices around the country. The city building in Champaign, I believe, was a WPA project. They did an amazing, airports, roadways, bridges, lodges in the national parks, all kinds of things. And artists found work, and he found work as a sculptor and did several projects up to 1941, doing occasional work with the WPA.
Say something about his art. It was kind of the sort of thing where you could put your hand on it and feel a movement. It was kind of chunky in a way.
Yeah, the book portrays the different styles. Every artist goes through periods of different styles, and he did a period of very massive muscular sculptures that I've seen described by art critics as bulbous proletariat, whatever that means. It was the funniest term when I saw that. But and then he did a lot of more abstract work in wood. He would go up in the mountains and find downed limber pine up near timberline and come back, bring pieces back and carve those, and did a lot of work in stone. And
Well, he met your mother there, I think, in
Yes.
Denver, and she would help collect wood too.
My mother, Marie Langley, had studied at the Chicago Art Institute for a year, very expensive, and so she came back after a year and took occasional classes at Denver University, DU, and in painting. She wanted to be a portrait painter, but she just was advised at Chicago Art Institute that she should take a sculpture course just to become really familiar with three-dimensional form. And so she took a class in sculpture, and that's the class my dad was teaching. So that's how they met there, and became friends, and she became very adept at sculpting, and actually as they got married, she actually became kind of a collaborator with him, and it was a sculpting team, and she learned all about mold making and became indispensable, not only to inspire him, but to assist in his work. And then a friend of theirs was Charles Diedemann on the painting staff at Illinois from Denver, and he knew Marvin and thought Illinois was looking for a sculptor to develop a sculpture program. So they recruited Marvin and brought them here, and in 1941, but then Pearl Harbor hit and it all went on hold. And then finally in 1944, they came here, and Marvin established the formal sculpture program.
Wow. I want to say that some of you people out there have some of this sort of history in your attic, and you don't think it counts, but in the future, people who are another generation will pick up some of this information and enjoy it. I've really found this book very interesting. We'll try and put some visuals in so that your father unfortunately died fairly early.
He died, yeah. So many of his family were long-lived people, but he had a massive stroke at age 56 and died. And I'm always a little feeling that the inadequate medical advice from the local doctor was contributed to delay in him getting treatment, because now the symptoms are obvious of a impending stroke. But so that's what happened, and so his creative span was cut way short. I often think if he'd had another 20 or 30 years, all the work that he could have done, and will never be realized.
Some of it was a little on the controversial side. There's a high school at
Boulder High School was a major controversy. The sculptures there seemed a little risque for some of the more timid citizens, but now the sculptures on the Boulder High School are just part of the fabric of Boulder.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn Martin, speaking about his family and his father, who has put together the sculpture program at the University of Illinois. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
Dave on the board, and we forgot to mention that this is January the 3rd. Are we up to
Yes.
as much as the 3rd already today? 2016. Don't forget to start writing that on your checks. And as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.